There are a lot of people who run around and get so worried about all the things they've done wrong that they can't even focus for a second on the things they did right. Greetings and welcome to Hello Kind Soul Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Ebony Green. So excited for you to be here today with us, where we uplift your spirit one episode at a time. So today I was thinking about a phrase that I say often, and the phrase is, I knew what I know. I knew what I knew when I knew it, right? And it makes me realize that's really the truth about our version of us becoming our best self, right? When we know better, we do better. Right? Or we don't, but we still have the information that's needed to proceed in a different manner, right? And so when I think about this notion of like parenting, which I think is like the perfect example of how when you have young people in this world and you do your best to raise them, that you really don't actually know what you're doing at all, right? Like you could read the books, you could listen to your parents, you could listen to your grandparents, aunties, community members, friends, whatever, about what you need to do. But there's always a personal decision that you, the parents of the children, decide how to raise them, right? And so one of the things that I think as a parent, when I look back, is that depending on how you grow up, if you come from meager beginnings, your goal, or at least my goal, right? When I was raising my children and they were young, my goal was to give them the best of everything, right? Because oftentimes you're thinking about like, what can I do to give you more, to be more supportive, to give you exposure to opportunities that I didn't get, right? All the things. And that sometimes when you do that, you're not really focused primarily on what are the best ways for me to show up as a parent. You're focused on how much can I work or do to provide them with material things, right? And so for me, I feel like the best story that I can share that kind of illuminates that is like, making sure that when my kids were young, I did my best to work as hard as I could to buy them stuff, right? Newer clothes, newer shoes, give them opportunities to play sports, particularly AAU basketball, right? All the things. But that when I think back, I wasn't as present as I could be. Like I made all the things you were supposed to do, like parent-teacher conference, the dances, all those things. But when you think about how much energy and effort goes into raising children, certainly you do realize at some point in your journey, and for some of us who knew it before I knew it, right? You get that the amount of time you spend with them is far more important than the amount of things you buy them, right? But for me, when I think of I knew what I knew when I knew it, when I look back, I spent a lot of time pursuing a career to get more opportunities to provide them with more, and did not spend enough time spending time with them, right? And so I think for many parents, there's a piece of guilt that you sit with because you realize that these valuable moments, right? That when they're little, you feel like you have millions of moments. And then as they get older, you almost realize how you blink and now they're grown and you've lost this amount of time because you haven't really spent the time focusing on them. And so when we think about like, once I knew better, once I really got to the place of awareness of like, it's more important for me to be able to spend far more time, the time was gone, right? They were grown, they were on their own doing their thing. And so oftentimes then when you think about it, it's like this space of discontent. Like, dang, I wasn't the person I needed to be for them because I was being the other person I thought I was supposed to be for them. And those people are not in competition, right? The truth of the matter is you work as hard as you can to provide them with material things, right? And opportunities and access and vacations and all that. But you also should be making sure it's balanced with the amount of time you spend with your children. So when you get to this place of knowing, right, then what comes next? And for me, it was like realizing that mistakes along the road is what we're all going to make. And some we are blessed to be able to go back and mitigate or fix, to revise, readjust. And then there are some that you're going to make that you can't fix, right? And so it tends to happen to people. And for many of you out there, like you sit with this space of like just guilt, right? Or you feel bad, like there were these things that I should have done that I didn't do, and now I can't go back and fix it. And so we can also think about it in the realm of relationships, right? When a relationship ends and you know that because you act in a particular manner or you did a certain thing that resulted in the end of something that potentially could thrive and could have been a great experience. Um, but what I'm going to put forth to you today is that when you recognize the mistake, right? When you unpack and process what it is or what you did, you have to sit in this place of like grace, right? Because I think the one thing we do really good as humans is beat up on ourselves. The one thing we do really well as humans is talk harshly to ourselves about the mistakes we've made. And the truth of the matter is, I'm as good as I can be on this moment at this period of time. Like anything else that I make a mistake around will come later in my life. But right now, I'm going to be the best version that I can be in this particular moment. I don't have the capacity to be any better than I currently am. And so when I say I knew what I knew when I knew it, it's like once I realized like how much time I missed not being able to always be and do all the things I needed to do for my kids, I had to get to this place of like sitting in my spirit and taking a break and being like, there were a lot of things you did well, right? And grant grace to myself to be able to kind of see that for what it is. And it's okay to say like, and then there are some things I didn't do so well, right? There were all these other things that in reflection, I realized I could fix if I could, but I can't, right? But what I can do is share with other people, particularly parents, and say unequivocally, you are going to do your best to give your children a better life than you had. And that's dope. But don't forget that the one thing that they need the most of is you. And so it's easy to get distracted by societal demands of like all the material things your children need. And then what happens is you lose you in it and you're running for the next title, the next role, the next, raise. And they're on the sidelines wondering like, hey, where are you at, right? And I remember having a conversation with one of them several years ago. I was actually just as I wrote this book, and he was reading a piece of it. And we started to just talk about like, how in reflection, there was such a level of guilt that I did not really work really well to create good relationships with them. Because I wasn't always present, fully present, right? So I could physically be in the presence of people and not actually be present, right? They could say, let's go watch a movie, and I could sit and watch a movie, but I would be on my laptop watching the movie, right? Which means you're really not watching the movie. So, but he spoke to like, we would wait for you to get to the weekend because we know in the weekends you would spend time. And then when we would go, to basketball tournaments, you'd always go, or for the most part, you'd go. And so the thing I really thought about was like, why would I have perceived that the more was the most important part? And then the obvious was like, because most of us believe that the monetary gain or monetary gifts that you give someone validates your worth in their life. And if no one else did that, I did that, right? I grew up in meager beginnings. I went to private schools, and in private schools, people are really good in making sure you understand that you're poor and you don't deserve to be there because you don't have a particular, the clothes or the cars or whatever, right? And so as I went through life, I started to attach value and worth to money, to titles, to status, inadvertently, unconsciously. And so then as a parent, it was like, okay, I may not be worth enough, but here are the things I have to give you. And so you keep giving your kids as many things as they want or you think they need. And the truth of the matter is when they look back, they're going to be like, I just needed like you as like mom or dad in my life, right? I just needed you as grandma in my life, right? You're going to realize that the thing that you think they need the most, while is important, is not actually the stuff, it's actually you. And so I share that with you to say like, once I understood what that meant, I was almost out of time in terms of like, they were grown. But the gift that I have to offer to you is an opportunity to really think about what that means to you in your life and to acknowledge that indeed it was a mistake. Indeed, I could have done things a lot better. But to really understand that our goal and role in this world is to tell the truth about situations that can inform other people's process. And so sharing that piece of like raising kids are really important to me because I think there are a lot of parents that I look to who are doing almost identical things that I did, which is like more of more. And that's just not always it, right? And so once I realized it was like, oh, okay, like that wasn't it. But it also helped me shift, right? So when you think about who you were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, while there are core components of me that are clearly still in existence, right? There are core values of who I am and how I operate and move that's very similar to who I was 15 years ago. There's a level of growth and depth and evolution that I sit with today. And let me just say this, it's probably just wisdom, right? From falling on my face a bunch that I didn't have 15 years ago. And so part of this is also about the fact that experiences shift you and shape you, right? Information changes things. So when you learn something from a negative experience or a good experience, you, if wise, look at those experiences and mine them for gold and then use that information to change the next decision, right? Use that information to implement action in your life. And so we have to recognize that through learning things, through experiences, that's where you get the wisdom to say, oh yeah, no, that's probably not a good idea, right? And you also gain a level of discernment that you wouldn't normally have. Like at 22, you probably could have sold me a bridge in Brooklyn. Like you could have said, there's a bridge, it's for sale, here's how much it is. And I'd be like, great. And I would have bought it, right? Because I didn't have a level of discernment. Like I was one of those people that really followed the rules, but believed things people said, right? But it also was from a lack of experience, right? And understanding that not everyone comes in a particular way that's honest or et cetera. And so knowing that, realizing that we are all iterative beings, meaning who you were yesterday, while you look very similar today, there's something in you that probably has slightly shifted, right? And that's good because that allows you to become wiser, to become more evolved, to become more the person or closer to the person you want to be in the world. And so it's not about always having all the answers, and it's not about protecting yourself from making mistakes. It is about saying, because I'm a work in progress, there are going to be things that I've done. There will be mistakes that I've made because I did not have the information that I have today, right? And that is okay. But here's the thing I want to share with you. I remember talking to my therapist. I forget about which thing I did wrong, but we were chatting about whatever it is I had done wrong. And when I chatted with her, I was like, I was really upset with myself for making this mistake and doing these things that I just didn't know wasn't necessarily, the right decisions to make. And I remember her asking me like, so what did you say to yourself when you made that decision? I was like, oh, you're an idiot. You're stupid. Right. It was this barrage of negative comments about myself. And she said to me, so let me ask you a question. If you had a child and the child is 2 years old and the child makes a mistake or has poor judgment, what do you say to that child? If the child is hungry, what do? Do you feed the child? And I was like, of course. Well, if the child makes a mistake, I'm like, well, you try to correct the child so that they know that, for example, the oven's hot, not to touch it, right? She's like, well, do you scream at the kid? And I'm like, well, no, who does that, right? And she's like, okay, well, I want you to think of yourself as a baby, right? And if you have a baby and they're hungry, you feed it. If they're thirsty, you give them something to drink. If they make a mistake, you try to correct the behavior. What you don't do is be disrespectful and rude to the baby, right? What you don't do is scream at the baby. You are compassionate and kind in knowing that the baby needs you to love and care for and nurture and protect it. So I need you to treat yourself like a baby, like a newborn baby. And when you make mistakes, I need you to be okay and understand that too is a part of living. That too is part of life. That it doesn't take away from the essence of who you are. What it does in some regard is it gives you an opportunity to not make the same mistakes again. What it does is give you the evidence that this may not be the best decision on this path for you, but it doesn't take away from your worth or your value. Like there are a lot of people who run around and get so worried about all the things they've done wrong that they can't even focus for a second on the things they did right. What we all can agree on is that everyone in this world makes a million mistakes a day. But if we use this notion of I knew what I knew when I knew it, it allows me to sit in a space to say, who was that person making that decision? And who is this person making that decision? And to be able to actually see the growth in who we are. That the same decision I made a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago, I'm not making the same decisions. Right? And that gives us this opportunity to re-expand of a place where we understand that our worth and our value is not contingent upon being perfect. Because what I know for sure, and I think I've said this before, oftentimes we live in this state of like, you have to be perfect or you're trash. But I don't know any perfect people. And anybody who says they're perfect is a liar. Full stop, right? We all make mistakes. And we all have to kind of go through this thing called life a little blind until we learn from those things. But I think the key is that the place that kind of allows us space to breathe is to realize like we also, if we're lucky, get to live long enough to make decisions that we know are better, right? And if we get an opportunity sometimes to go back, because I know there are people that like as I've grown, I've like caused emotional harm to in terms of like, breakups or things you said, whatever. And when I think about those places, I think about like to the most extent, or when I think about it, it makes me think about how hurt I was in that space of life, right? Because hurt people hurt people. So if you're in a place of healing and you think like, oh, I'm healed, I'm good, you can really inadvertently cause more harm. Because the truth of the matter is like, you don't get to a place of healing. It's this journey, right? You're constantly trying to grow and heal from different circumstances, situations in life. So the notion that you're going to like wake up and like just be perfect and always do everything right is nonsense. So when you're thinking about, well, what is this next what next happens, Eb? Like, so if I knew what I knew when I knew it, what happens when I now realize, okay, I've done this and I've done that and I want to be different? It's how do you put into action the lessons you've learned on your journey thus far, right? Like if I go and buy a car and the car is at a used car lot and it's trash, right? And I drive it off the lot and it falls apart in 3 days. I mean, I'm probably going to bring it back. But in case I can't, I'm not going to go back to the same place and buy another car, right? Because I will have now evidence that that may not have been the best decision. And so what I need you to do, what I want you to do, what I do, is that I spend a lot of time reflecting on some of those things that when you look back, it kind of make you cringe. Some of the relationships that you've lost for multiple reasons. And now you realize you could have done stuff very differently, right? Even with friendships, right? Because sometimes we stop talking to our own friends for nonsense. And instead of us saying to them, this doesn't feel good, or I'm struggling with this conversation, we cut them off because we don't have the emotional capacity to have that conversation that gets tough. So we just get rid of the person, and you look back and you cringe because you now, as a person who's learned little bit about life, realizes like, we probably could have worked through that with talking, right? Or we probably could have got to a better place with compromise. And so my goal in living life, and I'm assuming yours is too, is like, okay, I want to be better and different than I was. And so what I need to do is that at least when I look back and there are these circumstances and situations that bring me sometimes pain, that brings me sadness, it also brings me a space of hope. Because now I can think through to say, I'm a very different person. And if I continue to move in the right direction, to stay anchored in my core values, to stay grounded in the things I believe, I can, one, tell the truth about mistakes that were made and how you can essentially overcome them. I can have this conversation with myself in a compassionate way and be understanding that you just didn't know any better. And let me be very clear, not knowing better does not remove you from a sense of accountability. Like, if you've done something, myself included, that caused harm to someone emotionally, I mean, I've never physically harmed anybody, but certainly I'm sure I've caused some emotional harm. It doesn't take away your accountability of it, right? Like you can think about it and you can process it and you can kind of resolve it for yourself, right? And say, okay, I'm never going to do that, or I'm never going to live in that way, or I'm never going to say things that way again. But it never takes away the fact that you harmed someone with your words or your actions. And so please do not take what I'm saying as like this past that you can be like, oh, I just who I was, didn't mean it. Oops. Like, yeah, that's not how it works. But it does, when you think about it that way, it does help you realize that every single human being on this earth, I promise you, have caused harm or hurt in different situations. Every person on this earth have made decisions that did not serve them well. And the better version of us gets to a place where we're able to look at those decisions honestly and really process that the version of Ebony today would have never said that way, wouldn't have even gotten in that relationship, right? Wouldn't have even taken that job, wouldn't have even done that thing that I did 5 years, 4 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever ago, right? So it's also acknowledging that because information changes things and experiences changing things, you're a different person. And you can look back and cringe on that moment, but it doesn't take away the way you feel about, I can be a way better person today than I was yesterday. And so overall, I guess I'm going to leave you with a few questions, right? So one, how do you talk to yourself when you realize you made a mistake or you've caused harm? Like, right, what do you do to kind of rectify that with the person, with yourself, right? Because most often, while you may have done something and a job doesn't ever want to give you a good reference, or a person doesn't ever want to talk to you again, there's also a level of guilt that you sit with that you can't let go of. And so the reason I say, okay, come back to this place of like, if you were today who you were if 10 years ago you were who you are today, would you have made the same mistakes? Would you have done the same thing? And if the answer is no, then at least you can see like, okay, I've made this percentage of growth. But I think oftentimes we'd rather like not process stuff that's happened, which I totally understand. So, what are some ways that you can see that you're very different today, right? Which I think is a really important question. What are some ways that you shift the way you talk to yourself when you realize that you have made decisions or done things that didn't have the best outcome, right? What do you say to yourself that's in a loving way, right? And how do you move forward and be different based on what you've learned? Like what are the key steps to that? So those are 3 things I'm going to leave you with, folks. I also want to say to you that at the end of the day, we can always do better. All of us, collectively, individually, you can always do better. And one thing I think we often forget sometimes is to just simply recognize who we're becoming in a real way, right? And celebrate that for real. And sometimes, like when you say, like, "Oh, I'm doing this well," or "I'm doing that well," or you almost say to yourself, like, "Oh, I'm bragging. Let me not brag," right? I was listening to Jeremy Anderson the other day. Shout out to Jeremy Anderson, amazing human, and he was talking about this notion of like confidence, right? And when I think about what he was saying, like it's like when you first start out trying to figure out how to live a better way, how to improve the world, like literally, how to walk in purpose. It's almost like you're hunched over. Like I think of this person who's like hunched over because they don't see themselves in a way where they're proud. And so he was talking about this notion of confidence and how we start to stand up once we start to realize like who we are and what we're doing and the world we're trying to change, right? Things just feel different, right? And so as you become the better version of you, I just want you to stand up and be proud of that version, right? Because we can stay in a place of like, oh, we suck. I don't know what I'm doing. I haven't been a good person. Like that's a fine place to stay. I promise you, that's not going to lead you to the next level of your best self. So as you're, going through, you're listening to these podcasts, you're reading, you're doing whatever you're doing, and you're starting to feel like, oh, okay, it's like, so I'm learning this and I'm growing in this way and I'm changing this. And I want you to stand up and be proud of who you're becoming, because it's not easy to continue to try to be your best self. For many people, it's easier to stay mediocre. And my offer to you is to go beyond mediocre, right? Go to the next level, become the version of you want to become, stand in the purpose, change the world, have impact in a way that you could be proud of, and ultimately create legacy. When people look at what you've done, they can see from where you started to where you finished. So until next week, kind soul, I hope you have an amazing week. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, run over to Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, eGreen Equity, and also on YouTube. All right. But I'll see you next week. Have an amazing week. Take care.